Hi, everyone. Welcome to the American Press Institute's first session on transitioning to Google Analytics 4. I'm Claire, the facilitator for today. And so today we'll mostly be going over the differences between GA4 and Universal Analytics, and we'll also go over using Google Tag Manager. That's our recommended way of setting up for GA4. If you join us next week at the same time, we'll be going a little bit more depth into events and reports. So why do we need to switch to GA4? If you're here, you probably already know the answer, but what we really want to emphasize here is that data from Universal Analytics cannot be migrated to GA4. So the earlier you set up a new GA4 property, the more historical data you'll have, and you'll be able to reference back on that. Now to go over some changes between Universal Analytics and GA4. So in Universal Analytics, total users was the default user metric, and that's essentially what it sounds like. It's just the total number of unique users. But in GA4, they introduced a new metric, and that's now the default one, and that's called active users. And so that's the number of users who have an engaged session. Events are also a bit different in GA4. There are now 5 default custom parameters. We'll go over those exact 5 later in the deck. And you can also add up to 25 custom parameters. Bounce rate is also calculated differently in GA4. And so in both of them, it's if a user views only a single page on your website. But in GA4, they introduced this new timer. That's 10 seconds. And so the best way to illustrate that, I'll just give you an example. Let's say a user clicks on an article in your site. If they stay on that article for 2 minutes and then they exit out, under Universal Analytics, that would be counted as a bounce because they just read one page and left. But in GA4, since they stayed longer than 10 seconds, that actually wouldn't count as a bounce. And so you can think of it as the rule is a little looser, but if you want to make it more strict, you can change that timer. Audiences and segments are also different in GA4. Audiences, you can create them custom, and segments, you'll be creating those in the Explore tab. Goals are also different in GA4. They're a lot more simple. You can just toggle them to turn on, and you can have unlimited conversions per session. And so we're going to dive into Tag Manager now. That's our recommended way of installing GA4. Google Tag Manager is just a piece of code that sits on your site. It goes in the head and normally in the body tag as well. And so here's a live example of what that looks like on the Metrics for News site. You don't have to change it. It helps you create events and other things that are compatible with Google Analytics. So you can think of Google Tag Manager as an umbrella, and under that umbrella, there are all these events that normally would have been code, but now they're all easily encompassed under this umbrella. You can also think of it as a basket, same situation. You really only see the code snippet. You don't see all those other individual pieces of code, and so it's a much cleaner way to manage it. So let's walk through a scenario where Google Tag Manager could be helpful. So that's you over there on the left with waving your arm up. And let's say you want to track something on Google Analytics 4, but you don't have the necessary code on your site. So you have to go to a developer and ask them to put some code on your site. All done. The next time you have to go through the same process, go to a developer, ask them to put the code on your site again and again for all the different things you want to track. And that definitely takes a lot of time. And so with Google Tag Manager, there's you again. And now you go to developer and just ask them to put the code snippet, Tag Manager code snippet right onto your site. The next time you want to set up and track other things, you can just go to the Google Tag Manager website and set it up on your own. The code is already live on your site. You don't have to go through a developer every single time. You can just do that again and again on your own. Of course, there will be some times when you still need to ask a developer for help, but overall, Google Tag Manager is going to save you and the developer a lot of time. Other than the time-saving benefit that we just went over, there are also lots of other benefits. You can test everything in preview mode before you push it live to your site. You aren't changing any of the code on your site. You can test it just to make sure it functions properly. There are also templates available in Google Tag Manager, so you can just copy those instead of starting from scratch. Another benefit, of course, it's a Google product. It's compatible with GA4, Google Ads, lots of other things. And so what can you track with Tag Manager? So you can really track anything that you can think of that's hosted on your site. That might be newsletter signups, subscription purchases, if someone's logged into their account or not. Likely the only caveat is if there's something that's on a third-party site. So one example might be if a reader has to go to a third-party site in order to pay for a subscription, then you can't track that third-party site, of course, but anything on your own site, you can track. And so getting a little more in depth into how Google Tag Manager works, again, it's just this piece of code that sits on your site. And there are three main elements you're going to work with. So there are variables, there are triggers, and there are tags. And so a trigger occurs on your site. That's the first step. It activates a tag. And then that tag contains information from variables that can be pushed to Google Analytics 4. Essentially, the trigger is the user action. The trigger activates a tag, and that will bring the output into GA4. And then that output carries all details that you specify in the variables. And so going over the structure a little bit more in depth visually, triggers and tags both have variables. And within the tags, these variables are housed under something called parameters. And then those parameters then determine the custom definition in GA4. And so let's look at an example event. We'll start with the page view event. That's definitely what we're all interested in here. So as I mentioned at the beginning of the slideshow, every event in GA4 has 5 default parameters, and those are the ones in the black font that you see on your screen. Every event will include the location, the page location, the language, the page refer, the page title, and the screen resolution. That's default for every event. And then you can also add custom parameters that you want. You probably want to know the author of the article, maybe the topic that the article covers, and then maybe the account status if someone's logged in to their account while reading the article or not. And then when that's pushed through to Google Analytics 4, this is an example of how it would look. Essentially, all those parameters will be filled in. Going over another example, this time it's a custom event. Let's say you want to know if a user saw your paywall. You could create an event for that. And again, it automatically includes those same 5 default parameters that we talked about before, language, page location, etc. But you could also include other parameters, other custom parameters. In this case, maybe you want to know whether someone's a newsletter subscriber. So you have that custom parameter in the orange font there. And then when it's pushed to Google Analytics 4, again, all of those parameters will become filled in. So some custom examples do depend on how your site's code is written, but these are just examples of what's possible that you can set up in Google Tag Manager. So how is it actually displayed once it is outputted to Google Analytics 4? So this is the widget from the real-time dashboard in GA4, and there you can see the page view event at the top. You can see some other events below there. And so when you click on page view, you see all the parameters associated with that event. We just talked about page location, page title, and there are some custom parameters as well. Partner name, that's a custom one. And now if you click on page location, you can see all the URLs where that page view event took place. And so now we'll be showing a video demo of how Google Tag Manager works by our consultant, Brad Garrick.
Hi, my name is Brad Garrick, and I'm here to talk to you today about Google Tag Manager and how you can use that tool to supercharge your Google Analytics dashboard. And that's going to enhance your Metrics for News dashboard as well. I've been working with API for about 5 years. I may have helped set up some of your dashboards, so it's nice to see you again. And I'm looking forward today to taking you through a short deck that's going to give you the ins and outs of Google Tag Manager. Then we're going to look at a live version of Google Tag Manager and a GA4 dashboard. And along the way, we're going to talk about how those can integrate with your Metrics for News dashboard. So stick around. If you have any questions, I'm going to leave my contact information at the end. I hope you're ready to take some notes. Let's get started. Let's start with Google Tag Manager, which is at tagmanager.google.com, and then you can log in with your Google account. After we go through Google Tag Manager for a little bit, we're going to look at how everything looks in Google Analytics 4. For this demo, we're going to use the Metrics for News Tag Manager account. Once you log in, this is what it should look like. We just talked about the tags, triggers, and variables as the three main components of Google Tag Manager. So let's look at each of those. We're going to start with variables. There are two kinds. There are built-in variables and there are user-defined variables. All these built-in variables we simply activated, and you do that by going to Configure and then checking off the ones that you want to include. So you can see over here, form element is not included at the moment, but if we were to check it off here, now it's going to be added to the list. Anytime we create a tag or a trigger, we could include form element or any of these other variables here. Now, user-defined variables, these are custom variables. So if we wanted to create a new custom variable or user-defined variable, we would click New, and you would see a screen like this. You can name the variable whatever you want, and then you can go into the setup. There are a lot of different types you can go into here. Some of them I have never used and probably never will use. If you are a coder, have coding skills, you'll probably be able to get a little more use out of this, but even if you don't, the configured variables that are already available up here above are probably going to be enough for most of your work. With that overview of what the variables are and where you can find them, let's move on to tags. We're going to do tags before triggers, and I'll show you why in a moment. These are the ones we have set up for Metrics for News. This is the main configuration tag for Google Analytics 4. If you set up GA4 with Google Tag Manager, which is my recommended way to do it, you would do it with this configuration tag. If you wanted to create a new one, you would click New, and you would see something like this. There are a lot of different tag types you can create, just like the variables. After you create that initial configuration one that we talked about on the previous screen, and you might even have one for Universal Analytics set up, the GA4 event one is going to be the most common one you use. You're going to see there are a lot of different third-party platforms that integrate with Google Tag Manager, and just like with variables, a lot of these I've never used, probably never will, but there are definitely some useful ones outside of GA4, and in this case we're just going to focus on GA4. So that's going to be the tag type. Now it's set here. For every event that you want to create in Google Tag Manager that goes into GA4, you're going to have to select a configuration tag. Most of you are probably going to have just one. The one that, again, I think now 2 screens ago we saw set up. So anytime you create a GA4 event, you need a configuration tag. And then you choose an event name. It can be whatever you want. I'm going to keep calling this test event. Now, this is what's actually going to show up in Google Analytics 4. I recommend using the same schema they use, which is all lowercase, and instead of spaces, you would use underscores. If you want to use numbers, that's fine as well. The only time I might consider using uppercase is if it was a proper noun or something that made it easier to read, but otherwise I stick with lowercase and underscores instead of spaces. You can put spaces in there, and while you can use symbols like percentage, depending on where you export and analyze your data, it might be hard for certain programs to parse it. So again, I would just recommend, when possible, sticking to letters, numbers, and underscore. Up top, this is just what you're calling it in Google Tag Manager. This really has no effect on how it's going to show up in GA4, and you could call this test event. I actually usually start them with the event type, so GA4 event, and then you can do a pipe, or you can do a longer dash here, because if I was still creating a Universal Analytics event, I might say UA event, or you can call it GA4 configuration if it were in fact the configuration tag, as you see that's showing up here. But again, this isn't as important. It's for organizational purposes in Google Tag Manager, so I would be consistent, but you can kind of follow your own pattern. This is the event name again. This is how it will show up in GA4. We're not going to worry about these three today, but event parameters, this is where we talked about you can create custom parameters. In addition to the 5 that are included with each event, you can create up to 25 additional parameters. So again, maybe we wanted to use user ID, and the value then could be, we're just going to make this up, right? Because we don't really have this set up. Scroll depth threshold is the variable here. When we select it, these brackets indicate that it's dynamic. So whenever this event fires, a user ID is going to show up with it, and whatever the scroll depth threshold at that point is when the user is on the page and this event fires, that's what's going to show up in the data. So imagine we had a variable that was actually called user ID, and the output was either logged in or logged out. So in Google Analytics 4, you would see test event, there would be the 5 standard parameters, and then you would see user ID, and when you opened up user ID, you would have data on whether the user was logged in or logged out. We talked about some other examples that you could use, such as author or the section of the content. So this is where you would put them, and this is how you would configure variables. That's what the nice thing about these dynamic variables, which will also come into play on the triggers, which we'll talk about right now. Here's the triggers page, okay? And these, again, are the ones we already have set up for metrics for news. And you can see there's one that's from Google Analytics Universal. There are others that are for GA4. And if you were to go up to click new to create a new trigger, this is what it would look like. And I usually like to name them the same as I name the events. So it's going to be exactly the same. This will show up like this text in triggers, and since I named the tag in the other screen the same name, it would show up as well. So it's not going to be confusing if you name them the same thing, because they're going to be associated with each other and they're going to show up in different tabs here. Now, there are situations where it would use the same trigger for multiple events, so keep that in mind. If it's going to be a trigger that you use for more than one event, you probably don't want to name it the same thing as one of the events. Now, here are the different ways you can configure the triggers. We're going to get into these in just a second when we go into preview mode, but it could be something as simple as every time there's a page view, fire it, or you could fire it when just some of the elements on the page are clicked. But for now, let's go back to the event we were creating. And this is my preferred way to create triggers usually. We're already in the event, we've set it up, and let's just imagine we still had our user ID, and now we will set up triggering. Instead of going over to the triggering page separately, we can just click here, and if there's an existing trigger that we want to use, we could click it, right? But in this case, we do not want to use it, so we're going to close it out, and we could create a new one. And as you can see, we get back to exactly the same place as before. So that's why I would go into the tag page first and start with creating tags. Another thing to know when you create triggers, so maybe we want to fire this event when someone clicks contact us, or if we click the plus button, we could fire it when there's a trends box clicks. And it's not really important what those mean. I'm just selecting them to show an example. You can see this is an or situation. So you can have an event fire based on more than one trigger. If this fires and this doesn't, it's still going to fire. If this fires and this doesn't, it's still going to fire this event. So that's another thing that's good to know. You can also add exceptions. So let's say we want to do exceptions and create a trigger. Remember, this is an exception, so page view, and we can say just some page views, and we can select the page URL equals. So this would be an event that does not fire on the home page. Non-home page trigger. We click save. And now, for this test event, it will fire when someone clicks contact us, as long as they're not on the home page. So that's a really quick and dirty example of the different things you can do with the tags and the triggers.
So just to go over some quick takeaways from what Brad just went over, there's variables in Google Tag Manager. So you can activate built-in variables, or you can create user-defined variables if you'd like. Tags, make sure to set up the GA4 configuration tag and GA4 event tags. And triggers, Brad recommends setting up triggers underneath each event, and you can set up multiple triggers and exceptions. And now Brad is going to show a specific example in Tag Manager.
Let's look at an existing example. If you're familiar with Metrics for News, you probably know about the trends box that's on the left side of most of the dashboard pages. So this event fires to give the Metrics for News team a better idea of user behavior when users are clicking on the trends box, such as what page they're on. And in this case, we've added a parameter that's custom, that's partner name, and the value is publisher ID. That's a dynamic variable that we created, and I'm going to show you how we did that in just a moment. So let's close this out and let's go to something that's called preview mode. You would get a pop-up like this, and you would have to put the URL of your website in. You have to include this part at the beginning, so you can't just do metricsfornews.com, for example. You have to have the full URL. Click connect, and this is the part where we test things on Metrics for News or on whatever your website is without breaking the site or worrying about messing up data. So I'm going to sign in. I'm going to go to the stories page, and while I navigate here, you see the tag assistant is connected, so we're collecting data. Let's look at the Google Tag Manager preview dashboard. It says we're connected, great, click continue. You can see the blue diamond here matches up with the blue diamond down here. So we know that the data that's happening on this page is being tracked here. And every time we visit a new page, there's a new blue diamond. So now we're on the stories page, and this little emoji changes every time that you open preview mode. It's not always going to be a blue diamond. Sometimes they even use funny emojis like crabs or cows or whatever. It won't always be a blue diamond. In this case it is. Now let's switch to topics, and if we go back to Google Tag Manager, we can see that the blue diamond is still here. We're on the new page. Okay, but I want to go back to stories because that's where we have the trends box, right? So before we look at that, just want you to notice the different things that happen. These are the events basically that are happening on the page. So the container with the code was loaded, okay, DOM ready. If you don't know what these terms mean, don't worry, but this basically is showing you what happens at different points and what tags were fired in Google Tag Manager and what tags were not fired. So let's watch what happens when we click coronavirus in the trends box. We go back to the Google Tag Manager preview, and it's actually shown us that there are two different click events. That doesn't mean we've clicked twice. That's just the way it's configured. So if you see the first one, trends box clicks fired, the second one didn't. So this is the one that's interesting to us. We can click on this and see that the firing triggers both happened, and the one that's really important here, click classes equals fancy radio. So if we go back to Google Tag Manager for just a second and we look at the variables, there is in configure for the included built-in variables, click class is a built-in variable, right? And we can see it right here. So now when we go back to the preview mode, we can click on, remember we're only looking for event or item number 45 here. We click on variables. It shows us everything that happened when we clicked. Those buttons have a click class of fancy radio, and we know from testing that that's the only time that that click class fires, when we click something on Metrics for News. So if someone clicks that, it was in the trends box. Let's see what happens if we click topics, right? And we go back, we can see it's registered a click and a link click, and in neither of these cases did the trends box clicks fire. Why? Well, if we click into it, we can see not only was the click event not fired in this one, but the fancy radio button was not fired. So if you want to test, let's say we didn't have this set up yet, we could have also just gone in here, clicked on stories, and clicked on anything in the trends box. And then we would go back to preview mode. We would look at that click, and we would look at all the variables and see, is there something distinctive here that's going to allow us to identify that particular click. And in this case, it was fancy radio. If you don't see something distinctive enough, you could go back to the GTM dashboard and activate more built-in variables, or getting more complicated, probably with the help of a coder, create your own. The other thing you might notice here is publisher ID. In this case, it's recognizing that someone is logged in from Science News, and that's me. That is a custom JavaScript variable. So basically, by analyzing the code, we can click inspect, and then we're going to look for Science News. Okay, and there are different areas where we can find it in the code, and we could use, for example, the metadata to tell that it was Science News. What we could then do is go into Google Tag Manager, create a custom JavaScript variable. In this case, this is what it looks like. We have a publisher ID, and it basically returns the property name for the meta attribute name property name. And so that's why it's dynamic. Whatever is in this part here, that is what it's going to push to Google Tag Manager, and in the end to Google Analytics 4.